12 million Africans enslaved in the transatlantic trade, 400 years. We know this number. We've seen the diagrams of slave ships, read the testimonies, studied the Middle Passage. Now here's a number you probably don't know: 18 million, 1,300 years. Two massive trade routes that moved more Africans than the Atlantic ever did and killed half of them before they ever reached a market. The year is 1353. A Moroccan scholar named Ibn Battuta is crossing the Sahara Desert. In his travel journal, he casually describes massive caravans moving between West Africa and Morocco. Gold, salt, textiles, and 600 enslaved African women. 600 in a single caravan, for domestic service, for concubinage. And this wasn't unusual, this was routine. Between 650 and 1900 CE, 15 to 18 million Africans were enslaved and transported across two routes you've probably never heard of: the Trans-Saharan Desert and the East African coast through Zanzibar for 13 centuries. That's longer than the United States has existed as a country, twice over. And here's the part that'll keep you up at night. In some places, this trade never actually ended. The last eunuchs serving in Mecca weren't released until the 1960s. Mauritania didn't criminalize slavery until 2007, and it still happens there today. So why don't we know this story? That's exactly what we're about to uncover. This is part 2 of our series on slavery in Africa, and today we're asking the same question we asked about European Christianity and empire. How did theology, economics, and power combine to create a system of enslavement that lasted over a millennium? The answer is more complex, more brutal, and more relevant to today than you might think. Let's begin. In 1842, the British Consul General in Morocco, Drummond Hay, asked the Sultan Moulay Abd ar-Rahman to stop the slave trade. The Sultan's response was unambiguous. The traffic in slaves is a matter on which all sects and nations have agreed from the time of the sons of Adam. The abolition of this trade would be an innovation in Islam. I will not permit anything the Quran forbids, and I will not make unlawful anything the Quran has allowed. This wasn't evasion, it was theological clarity. Islamic law explicitly permits the enslavement of non-Muslims. But here's the critical difference from Christianity. Where European Christians had to twist the scriptures to justify their slave trade, Islam's texts explicitly allowed enslavement of non-Muslims captured in jihad. The debate within Islam wasn't whether slavery was permitted, it was about the extent of its application. So what did the Islamic texts actually say? The Quran uses the phrase "ma malakat aymanukum," what your right hands possess, as a legal category for enslaved people, particularly those captured in war. The phrase appears throughout the text. Quran chapter 4 verse 24 discusses sexual relations with enslaved women. Forbidden to you are wedded wives of other people, except those who have fallen in your hands as prisoners of war. Chapter 33 verse 50 addresses Muhammad directly about his rights to enslaved women as concubines. O Prophet, we have made lawful for you your wives to whom you have paid their full dowries, as well as those bondwomen in your possession, whom Allah has granted you. The Hadith, recorded sayings and actions of Muhammad, add detail. Historical sources record that Muhammad owned enslaved people. He received an enslaved Coptic Christian woman named Maria al-Qibtiyya as a gift, and she became his concubine. He had an enslaved Ethiopian eunuch. When Muslims conquered the Jewish settlement of Khaybar, Muhammad distributed enslaved people as spoils of war. These texts became codified in Sharia law. 1. Non-Muslims captured in legitimate jihad could be enslaved. 2. Children born to enslaved mothers inherited slave status. 3. Converting to Islam after capture didn't automatically grant freedom. Once enslaved, you remained enslaved even if you embraced Islam. For 13 centuries, two routes moved millions of Africans to their deaths or enslavement. The first was the Sahara. The Trans-Saharan slave trade began in the mid-7th century with the Arab conquest of North Africa, and it continued into the early 20th century. Between 7 and 10 million Africans were transported across the Sahara, but the full scale was even larger because approximately 50% died during the journey. For every enslaved person who reached a market, another died in the desert. The Sahara isn't like the Atlantic Ocean. There's no ship. You're walking, chained together with heavy forked sticks locked around your neck. extreme heat during the day, freezing at night. Days without water, inadequate food, complete exhaustion. The 19th century German explorer Gustav Nachtigall documented what he found. The poor children of the Black Countries seemed to meet death at the last stage of a long, hopeless journey. If these creatures lack strength to get up and walk again, they are simply abandoned, and their minds slowly fade under the destructive effect of the sun's rays, hunger, and thirst. But why did this trade last so long? What drove it for over a millennium? Islamic states in the Sahel, Mali, Songhai, later the Sokoto Caliphate, were selling war captives. North African and Middle Eastern markets wanted them. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt needed slave soldiers. Wealthy households wanted concubines and servants. The Sokoto Caliphate alone, by the 1890s, held more enslaved people than anywhere except the United States and Brazil. The justification was theological. These were captives from jihad against non-believers and corrupt Muslims. But the economic reality was that the Caliphate's entire economy ran on slave labor. Plantations, mining, domestic service, military forces, all staffed by enslaved people. When European colonial powers tried to pressure the Sokoto Caliphate to end slavery, the response was identical to the Moroccan sultans in 1842. This is permitted by Islamic law. We will not make unlawful what Allah has allowed. The second route was the coast, the East African slave trade. Between the 7th and 20th centuries, approximately 8 million Africans were enslaved through East Africa. 4 million went through the Red Sea to Arabia. 4 million went through the Swahili coast to destinations across the Indian Ocean. By the 19th century, Zanzibar was controlled by the Sultanate of Oman and had become the largest slave market in the world. At its peak, 30,000 enslaved Africans passed through annually. The routes were brutal. Enslaved people marched 1,200 kilometers to the coast in chains, carrying ivory tusks on their heads the entire way. Inadequate food and water, often for months. Those who couldn't walk were killed. David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary and explorer, documented what he witnessed in the 1860s. "We passed a woman tied by the neck to a tree and dead." The Arab who owned these victims was enraged at losing his money because the slaves became unable to march. Livingstone estimated that 80,000 Africans died each year before even reaching Zanzibar's markets. At Zanzibar, enslaved people were displayed for inspection. Buyers examined teeth and muscles, checked for diseases. Women and girls were inspected for virginity. Virgins commanded higher prices as concubines. Children were sold separately from parents. The market operated openly until 1873, when British pressure forced its official closure. But private sales continued for decades. The Arab-Islamic slave trade had a unique feature: the industrial-scale castration of boys to create eunuchs. Boys as young as 8 were subjected to complete castration, everything amputated level with the abdomen. No anesthesia, the mortality rate ranged from 60% to 90%, depending on period and method. Most died from blood loss, infection, or shock. Why accept this mortality? A castrated boy sold for 5 to 10 times normal price. Even with 70% dying, the profit on survivors justified the deaths. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of African boys were castrated over the centuries. The practice continued longer than almost any other aspect of slavery. The last eunuchs of the Ottoman court weren't released until the 1920s. The last eunuchs serving in Mecca and Medina remained until the 1960s. The Islamic slave trade in Africa lasted over 13 centuries. It transported an estimated 15 to 18 million Africans, roughly equal to the transatlantic trade, but over 3 times the duration. The mortality rates were catastrophic. Half died crossing the Sahara. 40 to 50% died marching to Zanzibar. 60 to 90% of boys couldn't survive castration. The theological framework was clear in Islamic law. The Hadith record Muhammad owning slaves. Some Muslim scholars debated the boundaries of these laws. What constituted legitimate jihad? How captives should be treated? Muslim leaders, like the Bey of Tunis, abolished slavery citing Islamic principles. This history doesn't diminish the horrors of the transatlantic trade. It completes the picture. It shows us that slavery in Africa wasn't the product of one empire or one religion, It was the result of how religious texts, economic incentives, and imperial ambitions combined across different cultures and centuries. Only by confronting the full scope of this history can we understand what was done to Africa and what continues to shape the continent today. Next time, Part 3. Modern Slavery. The legacy of the Islamic slave trade continues today in Mauritania, Libya, Sudan, Nigeria, and beyond. The past isn't dead. It's not even past. Subscribe. Part 3 is coming.